Okay, cool. All right. Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers whose work we think is relevant to rethink the question of the animal or the non-human. We are the Indian Animal Studies Collective, and my co-host, Dr. Anu Pandey from EFLU, is also here. I'm Susan Harris. I'm a PhD student at IIT Delhi. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics and writers who are working on animals in India so that we can think about what an Indian animal studies would look like, what it could mean, etc. For today, we have with us Dipesh Chakrabarty from the University of Chicago. We are here to discuss his new book, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. Please feel free to ask a question or comment at any point. Just unmute yourself or raise a hand or put the question in the chat box. Yeah, that's about it. The Anthropocene, it's a pretty important concept for my work, so it's really exciting to talk about it with you. I thought that maybe I was thinking about, in your book, one of the central strands or the central debates is it's between the two ideas of the human, the humanist interest in the man, and to think about equality and freedom, whose main concern is that. And there's the other camp who's thinking about the human as this kind of geological agent. And you mention it in your book, but why do you think it is important to bring these two ideas in conversation with each other? And where do you think the idea of the non-human figures in this? Because I know that you mentioned that the distinction between this natural history and human history collapses. So conceptually thinking, where do you think the question of the animal figures in this whole debate? You can just,
well,
your book.
yeah. No, that's all right. I'll just say what comes to mind. So first of all, let's talk about human history and natural history, and then we can find a place for the animal, with animal both in human and in outside of the human, and also and not just animals. So there's a huge distinction to be made between times in human history when the smallest things that humans could see were insects, and you really needed the scientific revolution, so-called, and some technological changes to happen before humans could become aware of microbial forms of life, right? So bacteria, viruses, protists, these come much later, because without the microscope, you wouldn't have even seen the bacteria. So in that sense, our knowledge of the non-human world has also grown, precisely as our capacity to manipulate the world has also grown. So if you go back to the 18th century, there's still a lot of biblical histories being written, which are sort of universal histories in which, of course, the non-human animal world and the human world is made together, right? So even in Buffon's kind of history, it's all happening together. In 19th century, I think, particularly sort of in 19th century, the separation begins to happen. You see it very clearly in the development of two subjects which kind of emerge at the same time, late 18th century, but go into two different directions. And you can see them today as the separation of ecology from economy. One is geology, the other one is economics. But in the 20th century, you see both, just as the human realm expands, the number of human beings expand, the number of amount of land under agriculture, everything expands in human history. And at the same time, this separation between human and natural also becomes wider. And so one person who kind of represents it in the 20th century, this separation, is Croce, the Italian philosopher. And Croce actually goes to a conference in Heidelberg in 1903, where a German economist whose double-barrel name escapes me now, was arguing that one should not confuse the history of humans with the chronological time that elapses in the history of things. But it sort of goes, but this separation builds on a question that was evolving in the 19th century, which was the question of human freedom. So, you know, some of the big debates of the 19th century, free will versus freedom, free will versus determinism, which even affected in Bengal the writing of some very famous novels. This question of human freedom emerged as history emerged as a discipline, again, in the early part of the 19th century. And two questions made for a distinction between, I'm talking about history as a domain of thinking and natural philosophy. The two questions were both questions of freedom. One was the question of freedom of humans from oppression by other humans, and the other was the question of freedom of humans from thraldom to nature. So, you know, you can see Hegel, or in 20th century Kojève's interpretation of Hegel, very much along those lines. And this is a question that eventually in 20th century, in the hands of Croce and then in the hands of Collingwood, became the proposition that things have chronology, but humans have history. So in Collingwood's time, in the 1940s and early 50s, there were several people, A. N. Whitehead, there was an Australian philosopher, second name was Alexander, in Oxford, who actually wrote a very interesting article called The Historicity of Things. And there was, of course, J.B.S. Haldane, who later came to ISI, right? And he was writing books like Everything as a History, 1951. And so there are these people who are claiming that, look, even mountains and rivers have history, in the sense that we can speak, same sense we can speak of human history. And Collingwood was saying, no, they have chronology. They don't have history, because humans have motivation. Humans have, and this question, motivation is a question of choice, freedom. So by the time you come over to the 50s and 60s, when both in Europe and elsewhere, a lot of new universities are set up. And you actually see a process, first in the West and then even, you know, in South Asia and other places, of a lot of first generation entrance into higher education. And in fact, it's the question of freedom that becomes the key question from the 1960s on. So whether you have civil liberties movement in America, the Maoist movement in India, indigenous people's movements, minority people's movements, and even when in the 70s you have the rise of the environmental movement. I mean, environment is still seen as one factor among many in history, right? So people were writing histories like, did climate play a role in the French Revolution? Ladoury's famous book, which was like treating climate as a factor, environment as a factor, which is why when green parties arose in Europe, we used to call them single issue parties. And the big difference today is that with Anthropocene, with IPCC reports, we are actually, the very meaning of the word environment has changed. So we don't think of environment as a single issue factor. We don't think of it as a single factor among many other factors. In some ways, we think of environment as the envelope within which everything is happening. And the other thing that's also broken down is the separation that one is to make between the organism and its environment, right? And now we think of human bodies, and you have a microbiome. So your body is the kind of habitat for zillions of microbes, which determine your moods, which determines your health, which determines your well-being, your ill-being. So you realize that it's not like the organism is tightly sealed from the environment. The environment, so-called, is both inside and outside the organism. So all of these ideas have changed, and therefore the separation we used to make between natural history and human history was getting challenged. But when the IPCC reports became well known, the claim that humanity collectively and human institutions and the animals we keep, the technology that we have produced, that all this complex collectively was having an impact on the planet, which was somewhat similar to the impact of an asteroid strike in terms of species extinction. That you could see that collectively we had a thing-like character. Like if the asteroid is a thing, then we have a thing-like character. So, so in some ways, what I mean, we are actually having to deal with these 21st century problems with our minds having been trained majorly by the 19th and 20th centuries insistence on questions of freedom, which takes different forms, right? From rights to sovereignty to all kinds of questions that arise within freedom. So the question of human freedom remains important, because that's how we've grown up thinking it to be very important. While the thing-like character of humanity, or this complex that I was describing, not just humanity, as a whole, is being argued for and proposed by the IPCC. So that's why I'd say that the human history and natural history separation that was made from the 19th century and got kind of theorized and even reified in the 20th, that separation appears to have collapsed. Now, within that, so the animals, where are animals? So animals have, so first of all, there's an old distinction that humans made between wild animals and animals that are domesticated, right? And that distinction is there between, say, I think the very idea of a human habitation, collective human habitation, assumes a certain kind of protection from wild animals. And that is what then you see it sort of incorporated into political thought. So when Hobbes thinks about the role of the state, and he says the role of the state is to secure human life and property, he assumes that wild animals are part of the state of nature. They're not even part of human civilization. So humans have a right to kill wild animals because wild animals have a right to kill humans. That's Hobbes' position. Nietzsche similarly assumes that human freedom means freedom from wild animals. So there's a question of what Haraway calls companion species, the species we actually, keep as pets, or then there's a question of wild animals that actually depend on our existence, like the urban squirrels in America. If humans were not there, the squirrels wouldn't exist. I mean, they would be eaten up by coyotes or foxes. So that's the question of animals, but the non-human is a much larger thing, right? The non-human includes microbial forms of life, but it also includes non-living entities. So that's a much larger question, but I'm just simply breaking it down at least into sort of this distinction between so-called what humans regard as wild animals and what humans regard as companion species or animals we're prepared to live with. Then the question of the microbial forms of life, and then the question of the non-living non-human. That is also that's also part of things we're related to. We impact on. So what's becoming clear is the question of human entanglement in all of these. As they said, the geobiological history of the planet. Okay, Susan, that's a long answer to the question you asked.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I did notice that one of the things that your work allows for is that it's not just restricted to a particular kind of animal, but that it seems possible to account for different kinds of animals or non-humans. So I think that's something to think about. But since you mentioned Haraway, I've always felt this while reading your work. While Haraway says something like make kin but not babies, I've felt that you really position yourself in the realm of the humans, so to speak. And there is this kind of association with the humanist tradition and thinking about humanism seriously. And really, do you think that is because you are acutely aware, or because you sympathize with the post-colonial concerns, such as the obvious inequalities amongst humans, or is the humanist concern some kind of possibility of ethics that could be available even for the non-human?
There are two things. One is, of course, that I take human experience seriously. Because I actually think, we are like our this whatever mechanism or organism we are individually. Experience is very important to our living. So, to find an evening beautiful, to fall in love, or to hate somebody, or to be angry about something. I mean, these are such fundamental aspects of being human that whatever happens in the world gets refracted through this instrument that we are for experiencing the world. And we know cognitively and in other ways that our experience is always very partial, right? So you spend if you think about it, it can drive you mad that you never see your backside, except with the help of a mirror. If you think, given that the amount of time that every human being spends in front of the mirror every day, if you thought about it, we could go mad thinking, why can't I see my backside, right? Why don't I have eyes at the back? The fact is, we don't have eyes at the back. You could go mad thinking, why can't I see all the colors of the spectrum? Why can't I see the electromagnetic waves around me? So we know that we actually, our mechanism, a perceptual, experiential mechanism that we have been given through evolution, gives us only a very limited hold on the world. But it is through that limited hold that the entire drama of human life is created. And the political question, the moral question. So in some ways, I think we can't discuss the crisis meaningfully without giving the human its due place in the schema. Then the other more important problem is that, see, some people think, in Haraway, in Latour and others, they often think that there is an ideal place to be, where there could be a parliament of things, or there could be a kinship. You make kinship, or you just stay with the trouble. But the trouble doesn't stay with you. Trouble gets bigger. You try to stay with the trouble. It's not. There's no place of equilibrium to be reached, because the trouble is not entirely it doesn't exist by your definition, and it's not entirely in your control. But the other interesting thing I find, which raises a more fundamental question in my mind, with regard to the metaphor of making kin is that is the kind of knowledge we have, and I'm talking about modern knowledge. I mean, one can then go and talk about indigenous forms of knowledge. That question comes up, but talk about modern knowledge. The knowledge we have, let's say, if viruses and bacteria were human beings, and you looked at the kind of knowledge we have of them, then that knowledge would look like colonial knowledge. Because we find out about them in order to control them, in order to defeat them in certain battles, in order to make sure that they can't upset our living, our life, right? And if you find out that a virus is going to kill you, you go to war with it, as we are doing in the pandemic. So different forms of lives are connected. In some ways, we are kins, but we're also kins that kill each other, can kill each other. And therefore, again, I'm in two minds. For me, it's an open question whether one should try to extend the human conceptions of the political or human conceptions of right to the non-human. And I think to certain kinds of non-human, you may be able to do it. With certain kinds of animals, you may be able to do it, as the animal rights people argue, but they actually put a sentience threshold. You know, like, so basically, someone like Peter Singer would say that with regard to an animal that can anticipate its killing and can actually experience fear or pain, so his kind of ethics of animal liberation extends to that animal, because that animal can anticipate its own killing. But there are animals which may not be able to, or forms of life that cannot be able to anticipate, feel pain in anticipation of getting killed. And Peter Singer would say, I don't take my philosophy there. Right? So sometimes that's described as a sentience threshold. So given the diversity of the non-human world, it might be possible to extend it to some of the animal world, but not all of the non-human living world. So that's another big question mark I have about the making kin proposition. So that's one reason I think humans, for me, it's more a mad question of humans being willing to learn about their limitations and acting within a certain wise knowledge of those limitations. So being genuinely Homo sapiens, the wise Homo, right? Rather than being the idiotic Homo that kind of extends its realm without thinking about the consequences and brings wild animals back into our cities. So, you know, there are so many videos on YouTube of leopards coming into Bombay suburbs, for instance, or monkeys coming into Delhi, or rhinoceros and elephants coming into villages. Now that's, if you expand the human realm and drive wildlife out of their habitat and force them to come close to us, then you're basically, your own civilization is threatening one of the basic assumptions of human civilization, which is that wild beasts are kept away, right? So humans had gotten to a point where our main predators were viruses and bacteria. And now we seem to be inviting them into our lives by destroying forests, by destroying the habitat of, you know, wild animals that carried these bacteria, so that, you know, or viruses which now jump species. So in some respects, human civilization itself seems to have extended so far that it's overturning its own assumptions.
Yeah, it's, when you're talking about, I do agree with you that, you know, there is the human way of perceiving and how important it is to even think or even really see the non-human in that way. And, you know, it's also related to the question of skepticism, you know, like how much can you know about anybody else, not just the human, but also about the world around you. And I think it makes sense even when you consider climate change and how long people were skeptical about it, and how long people were denying it, and so on. And in I think in your introduction you talk about this double figure of the human, and how that figure of the human has to now think about other forms of life.
Yeah.
And I suppose you are gesturing towards some, I'm not sure what exactly you mean by it, because a lot of people seem to suggest that there could be non-anthropocentric ways of thinking. But I do know that you are also thinking about these things in conversation with the discipline of history, and thinking about Anthropocene as a concept, and so on. And how do you think it is possible to think about other forms of life when we do know that we are geological agents and these distinctions are breaking down, and so on? I mean, is it conceptually possible to really think about these forms of life, or do we simply become aware of these changes?
No, see, I mean, we have obviously human ways of thinking about other forms of life. I mean, we have human ways of non-anthropocentric thinking. I mean, even non-anthropocentric thinking is being done by humans, right? So if you go to a discipline like geology or evolutionary biology, humans come so late in this story that you can't make humans central. I mean, these are scientific disciplines which tell the history of the human in a non-anthropocentric way, because of the way they're structured. So humans themselves, it's not like you have to be a non-human to have a non-anthropocentric way of thinking.
Right, but
Because
just
what
to
we can't do, I mean, it's sometimes, the more imaginative experience, sometimes people say, so what would polar bears have to say to us? Or what would, as Leopoldo said, what would a mountain say to us? How do we think like a forest? As Edward Kuhn asked, right? So that's a good exercise of imagination. I mean, in school, we were always asked to write autobiography of a road, right? Or a tree. And you somewhat anthropomorphize that being to tell the story. So when you ask what would a polar bear have to say, you have to endow the polar bear with certain capacities for feeling, certain emotions. But it's a mental way of saying, how do I look when I look at myself from outside of myself? So to produce outside of oneself experience, humans have done it for a very long time in different contexts, right? I mean, even in to do look, when India began to think of somebody like M.N. Srinivas, when Indians themselves became anthropologists, they became outsiders to their own cultures, or at least have taken outside position of their own culture to write work. So I don't think that is a problem for humans. We can always do that. The question is, what do we do with that? And see, today the science of the Anthropocene is accepted both by people who say, okay, we've gotten to a point of no return, let's expand the human realm, let's make it even more human. So geoengineering is a proposition that says, let's take control of the planet from the same science. And it's also on the basis of same science, you could say, let's cut back. So Edward Wilson has this book, Half Earth, where he's saying, let's leave a lot of this planet for other forms of life because we need biodiversity. Let's not interfere. So the same science can give rise to two thoughts. One is make it more human-centric, make it more human-dominated. The eco-modernists and the geoengineering people are often of that thought. But then you have scientists who are saying, let's cut back. Now, how do you cut back? So then there are human differences. Somebody will say, let's degrow. Somebody has some other idea of, not degrowing, but maybe not cutting forests. There are many different set of propositions on the desk, but these are all, so going back to your question, I mean, I think these are all different ways we go from the same science. From the same science of climate change, it does not follow automatically that there should be a morality of degrowth, a morality of cutting back. Right? Some people are arguing, no, we should actually even do more. I mean, like some people argue that there should be more capitalism so that humans have more money and more wealth to be able to deal with the disasters of climate change. I mean, it's now argued a little less, but it used to be argued very strongly 10 years ago. And the whole economist debate on discount rate depended on those sorts of propositions, whether we should grow rich now so that we can pay for all the damages later. So the point I'm making is that non-anthropocentric thinking is part of climate science, earth system science. But that thinking does not itself give rise to an answer to the moral question: what should humans do?
Right.
And my sense is that when I read Latour or Haraway, I kind of feel that they're giving me a picture of where ideally, according to them, humans should be, but nobody knows the path to that state.
Yeah. But just thinking about these, thinking about these questions from within the sciences, I also feel that the orientation is such that there is such a heavy emphasis on finding solutions and how to overcome this obstacle and so on. So what I had in mind was specifically, something like poetry or literature that perhaps describe in non-anthropocentric ways, perhaps even through anthropomorphism, different forms of life. And if maybe that could offer us, if I feel so silly saying this, but some kind of subaltern histories of the Anthropocene, because otherwise what we would have is some kind of a circle jerk conversation where we're thinking about the human and the non-human, but only trying to advance the question of the human in different ways.
Well, advance, or I might say we may also try to draw limits on the human. So it's not, I mean, we can have the discussion. Well, in the book, I try to explain Adorno's negative universal history, take help of that idea to say that the question is, how do I think of the polar bear's position without anthropomorphizing the polar bear? See, in other words, the condition for inclusion into a compact of, let's say, all living, forget the non-living, all living creatures or creations, if the condition of inclusion is that they all have to share in the human imagination, then that in itself seems to be like an undemocratic condition of inclusion. So that's why I find it also problematic when people want to create this oneness. Because this oneness has to be, think of two human groups with two different languages, right? And they share a certain basic sign language. But beyond that, when we think of an interaction on some basis of equality, on some basis of democracy, we ask them to learn each other's languages, right? And often our own experience as Indians with some Indian language is that we meet with people with whom we can converse in English, but a lot of what I might think in Bangla, or you might think in Malayalam, I guess, or what's your language? I don't know. Yeah, then a lot of this would remain uncommunicated because the languages don't meet on grounds of equality. But see, we don't know polar bear's language. I mean, we don't even know dolphins' language completely. We don't even know dogs' language completely. So to think that we can include them in some kind of commonness on equal grounds, on grounds of equality, I think it's very difficult. Whereas I find it easier to, it goes back to the question of ethics, I find it easier to think about the limited nature of being human and building institutions and economies and things which are expressly an acknowledgement of those limits. See, the other thing you realize, and I mentioned it in the book, is that humans are a minority form of life. The majority forms of life, and they're more critical and important forms, they're more important to continuation of life than humans are microbial. So if a minority, so again, among humans, if a minority group of humans dominated the hell out of a majority group of humans, you would have a situation like apartheid. Right? Now, are we committing something like apartheid? So if you take the position that we are committing something like apartheid, then you would have to ask, how do humans behave actually as a minority form of life among many other forms of life? And that ethically might take you to a position where I don't go, which you sometimes see in Gandhi's life, where Gandhi would care for the dying, but not try to extend their life. Right? I mean, he would not care for extending their life, but he would care while they were dying. In a somewhat like Mother Teresa mode. Now that is a very interesting position that he took, and I don't go there for reasons we could discuss. So my own position professionally is that we should focus more on the limited, on the limits of this creature called the human, and not try to exceed these limits so much that we create a crisis of biodiversity. We create a crisis in the history of life, because that actually imperils our own existence. So you see the distinction. I think there are people, very thoughtful people, who are trying to say, let's expand the realm of the political to the non-human. And I'm saying, A, that looks very difficult. I don't know how to do it. B, that may very well have the assumption that they come in on our terms, as it were. That we make them speak our language by appointing representatives to speak for them. So you might have to speak for fish, or a particular school, species of fish in a parliament, which has its own problems in political theory. So I'm actually, so I'm not going there. I'm just saying, but it's clear that human civilization has expanded to a point where it's undermining the assumptions of human civilization. One of which was to stay safe from wild beasts or from predators. And the wild beasts are coming into cities everywhere. You can document that because they're losing habitat. And our real predators, the viruses and bacteria, are coming more and more into our lives, endangering us. So clearly, our civilization has gotten to a point where it is actually imperiling our existence. And that's why we need different institutions, we need different kinds of civilizations which are based on a recognition of the limits of being human. Okay, so I think there are questions.
Yes, Anjali has a question.
Anjali.
And maybe Anu after that.
Sure. Anjali, do you want to ask your question, or should I read it?
I could read it out, Anjali, or maybe you could just ask.
Yeah, no, it's just that I was wondering, like we say, historically speaking, also in a cyclical sense, things reach a certain point and then they just go down or repeat themselves. So that in that sense, does it surprise you that we have reached here and now we are talking of this end of human civilization as we know it? So I don't know, to me, in a way, it's not very surprising. So I would like to know.
Well, I mean, look, there are many cultural repertoires we have, particularly there are many strands of Hinduism in which no catastrophe is surprising, because that's how new things begin. So whereas in Christianity, there's the sense of apocalypse, or in Islam, which is like the end. Whereas for Hindus, every end is the beginning of something else, right? So culturally, we have these ways of thinking, and I don't deny that. But I'm not talking, in a Toynbee-like fashion about rise and fall. So species go extinct. Humans were scheduled to go extinct, even though when the Russian Sputnik was launched, Hannah Arendt thought that it kind of guaranteed survival of the species, because if they couldn't survive on this planet, they would go somewhere else. But we are actually talking about the collapse of a civilization, which is different from fall. The Mughal Empire fell, but India continued, right? And some people say that even flourished in the 18th century as they fell. But we are actually talking about a collapse. And the problem with the collapse, and this is where I become a humanist, is that the people who pay the price of a collapse are the most advantaged people, because they have the least wherewithal with which to deal with the collapse. I mean, as you saw, even with the migrant workers, and right. So the burden of a crisis falls on the poor. And that's why I come back to politics. That's why it's a moral question. I mean, it's really up to people to educate ourselves, to put pressure on powerful people, politicians, business people. I mean, look, in India, by Indian reports, I mean, there are so many hills in the Aravalli range in Rajasthan that have just been illegally razed to the ground. They exist on state or topographical maps. They don't exist. So we are doing terrible things to ourselves, in search of profit. A couple of years ago, I was in Kerala, at Kottayam, giving a talk at the Mahatma Gandhi University there. And a physics professor told me that because of sea level rise, the coastal waters inland were already very salty, and you couldn't cook with them. So women from poor families had to go longer distances to get just fresh water for cooking. And she was saying the politicians wouldn't talk about this. But you can see climate change affecting lives. So in my mind, the political has become even more important, the human political. I mean, when we will extend it to other non-humans, but even in a self-interested manner, we should think about it, because the collapse would mean that we all suffer, but the poor suffer much, much worse, very badly. So I'm talking about a collapse and not a fall. So it's not cyclical. And also, if it gives rise to, if human actions do end up causing the sixth great extinction of life. And the biologists argue that we are in the first phase, because even these extinctions take place over geological time scale, not like 10 years or 20 years, and then regeneration of life takes millions of years for biodiversity to come back. And one lesson we know from the earlier 5 extinctions is that the species that dominated before the extinction ends up not being a dominant species anymore, right? So some dinosaurs grew wings and survived. And now some humans may survive, but in what form? So in a very self-interested, human-centric way, it's a major problem. And I feel that we're riding a beast that we can't get off, and both individually. I mean, in many ways, in our lives, our lives are all integrated with institutions that have come up on the old assumptions. So if I look at my pension funds and think of retiring soon, I mean, I don't want climate change. I want my pension funds to pay for my, next 20 years of my life, or however long I might live. So our interests are all tied to older imaginations. Whether you're looking at investment portfolio, divestment, whether I'm looking at my small investment as a teacher. That's why it's a very, very tough, it's a very tough question. And without governments creating rules, without people being able to put pressures on governments, it would be, I mean, most well-to-do humans would think I would somehow escape this. The brunt would be borne by poor people. And they don't realize that even if a lot of humans suffer, I mean, that world won't leave them in peace. I mean, as we know from California, from Australia, where rich people suffer.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And Anu, you had a question.
Yes, Dipesh, I'm next. And mine is a question of, curiosity.
Yeah.
You've outlined your trajectory as a researcher in your introduction, and it's very fascinating to read how you perceive it yourself, your growth as an academic and the direction you've moved in. And then one sees that in 2009, you wrote The Climate of History, and in 2021, you wrote The Climate of History in a Planetary Age. And so, that trajectory is kind of also concretized in the shape of two major publications, a revision, so to speak, of an earlier work that you have brought out. And then in your the chapter here with the 4 theses, you talk about what we need to do if we want to historically place the crisis of climate change. And you say that we require to bring together intellectual formations that are usually or are in tension with each other. And I found it's interesting, striking, intriguing how you've placed the binaries, because you don't say the global and the planetary, recorded histories and deep histories. You say it the other way around. So you say the planetary and the global, deep and recorded histories, species thinking, and critiques of capital. And I was curious to know whether this is a conscious choice that you made or decision, or is this just a reflection also of the direction your research and your thinking has taken?
So, first of all, they're not binaries in the sense that they're not mutually exclusive oppositions. I clearly say that the planetary is connected to the global. It's the expansion of the global that actually makes the planetary visible to everybody. It was previously visible to geologists, but it becomes everybody's concern because of climate change and these sorts of things. And that's happening because of the expansion of the human realm, which is the global. Well, let me give you an instance of deep history and recorded history. I do talk about it, but the thing is, deep history, let's say it's the history of evolution of human beings, is something that is running through all of us. So your body was born when you were born, and your body as it exists will die when you die. But your body wasn't designed at your birth. Your body was designed, like my body was and everybody else's body was, through a deep history of evolution. So if you ask, when did humans have a hand where you could oppose the thumb to every other finger? And you can't make a human artifact without assuming this. Whether it's a cup of tea, in a teacup you lift up, or whether it's a gun, or whether it's a fighter plane you're flying, this is a basic assumption. Binocular vision, you can't do anything, make anything without assuming this. But this has taken millions of years to develop. So this is from the hominin period, the evolution. It goes back to even long before Homo sapiens, this development of the hand. The binocular vision is a very fascinating history where basically, fruits come late in the history of trees. And trees began to produce fruit when forest grew so thick that the wind could not carry the seeds to other distances. And then what happened was, and this was happened in the age of mammals. And see, most mammals during the dinosaur age, most mammals had night vision, like rats still do, right? And through evolution, through a kind of peculiar reverse engineering, gave monkeys a capacity to see color. So even though monkeys are mammals that come from the history of having only night vision, monkeys developed color vision, so they could see the fruits and be attracted to the fruits. And that became a way of the tree reproducing itself. Because the monkeys would eat the fruit, and then their feces would spread the seeds around. So deep history is absolutely part of everything we're doing. We're looking at each other. I'm speaking. I'm actually I'm the owner of a design that I was not made by me or even by my parents. It has taken millions of years to create this design. And the design is shared. One reason why the coronavirus can come into our cells is because, having lived in the guts of bats are mammals, for millions of years, it gets pre-adapted to the human cell. The reason you can test out medicines on other animals, mammals particularly, is because the bodily design is shared with them. Right? So that's deep history. Deep history is about the connected histories of your body with other bodies, and that's evolutionary history. Normally in writing history, I would just take that for granted. So just say you're writing the history of a gang rape. In normal human history, it's really your emotional outrage with the fact of a gang rape. And maybe the socioeconomic explanations as to why it happened would take place. But the designed bodies that actually engaged in that, and even the history of emotions that actually were manifest, it's something I would not normally think about. But this crisis is making deep history not just the concern of specialist evolutionary biologists who used to think about these things. It's becoming a concern for me as a humanist historian. Or to give you another example, one of the booming aspects of economics is what they call behavioral economics these days. So my colleague Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize for. Now he has a book with Cass Sunstein, who works on risks and things. And my economics colleagues tell me that one of the cutting edge thing is to work with psychology. So basically, economics and psychologists are coming. And these are psychologists who do experiments with human beings, with sometimes maybe even with rats. And in psychology, they try to find out what they call everyday heuristics. Like questions like, why do humans tend to depend on their experience more than on abstract knowledge? Now, what psychologists are thinking of as the habit of present-day humans is actually a deeply set evolved trait. An evolutionary biologist would probably say, look, being short-sighted and being guided by experience definitely helped in our survival. And that's why it's become a trait in us. So what I became aware of in the course of doing this work is, we are immersed in deep history, we are products of deep history. The separation of the natural from the human made us blind to deep history and how it's working through us. And that's why I say now we can think of bringing these two perspectives together. If I had written species first, I had not done that consciously. So I don't think I was expressing any preference, in what I mentioned first. Yeah, but thanks for pointing it out. I mean, I'm probably expressing a habit of thought, nothing more.
I think Professor Rukmini has a question.
Yeah.
Rukmini, before you came on, I was just remembering the time I met you and your friend. It was in Oxford or somewhere.
Yeah,
And
Cambridge.
we're all
or
Cambridge, and
Oxford,
we're all students then.
yeah, that's right. So
Yeah.
that seems like it geological
Ages,
ages before.
geological ages ago, ages ago.
But I just wanted to also ask you a couple of questions, and maybe to remark about your notion of deep history, and particularly in relation to the history of the human species. But before that, I wanted to say that we have, of course, all of us carry 4 to 5 ounces of bacteria and viruses within our system. And so we host these all our lives. And we have curves of, growing curves of hosting viruses. And so they would not survive without us, and we would not survive without them in the sense of this hosting question. But that's just a throwaway remark. And the other 2 remarks which struck me when you were talking was about your comparison of us to an asteroid, a thing. And what struck me about that is that we normally attribute no agency to an asteroid, but our thinginess seems to involve agency. So how do you reconcile that? That's another thing that struck me when you were speaking. And finally, this question of not seeing our backs being a frustrating thing. And even more frustrating is the fact that we go through a whole lifetime without ever seeing our interiors.
Yeah, totally. It's very frustrating.
And so we don't have we don't have an aesthetics of the interior. So nobody falls in love with your great colon or something.
Yeah,
So
right.
or your heart muscle. So this business about having to make inferences in an intentional system, which we can only judge from the outside because we cannot access each other's intentionalities, is a common core phenomenon, whether we are trying to figure out the intentionality of a bat or an intentionality of another human, because that's the way we are not built with transparent screens on our chests. Right. So we can't really, but that's not my question really has another sort of angle, which is your use of the planetary age. And as you know, for those of us who do sort of look at deep history and look at human history, when language was acquired and so on and so forth, we use a terminology such as the axial age, when human beings began to have external memory systems outside the body, like writing. And preceding that, you had kind of maybe at least 100,000 years of human history. And so you don't use notions like the axial age. And when talking about geological time, you mentioned the Holocene, but do not look at the significance of things like the Meghalayan age, which comes towards the end of the Holocene and is about the climate change of a very drastic nature, which decimated human beings and drove them around. So that was nature decimating us. So the notion of the planetary age in some ways sits uneasily with conventional usages in linguistics and linguistic theory, and also in geology, because I myself work with geologists, anthropologists, to track nature. So I wanted to understand more clearly why you would call it a planetary age and how you would date the planetary age. Finally, there's one other sort of point which has not been discussed, which is your notion of technology, which is clearly very important. But you seem to think of technology as something post-industrial revolution. But technology is like writing, cognitive tools, which we have used for thousands of years. And if you look at paintings on walls, you're already defacing, on cave walls, you're already defacing nature. You're already sort of, in a way, thinking in your portraits of throwing javelins at animals and so on, thinking of yourself as a person, as a group who has the capacity to destroy. And you see this very early on with the simplest technologies. And so I don't see that there is, except in terms of degree, but not in terms of cognitive constraints, that there has been that much difference, because the constraints remain the same. As a linguist, I could say we can't reach into our minds and count the number of morphemes there. We can't do it. That's a constraint. We can't construct center-embedded sentences. That's a constraint. So we have the limits, and we can only think within those. If you want to really understand what how we have changed, should it be only a matter of degree, that we are managing to kill more species, or is it, how do we think of constraints? Because those constraints have hardly changed, except, today we type with all fingers. That's a constraint. That's a constraint overcome, because we used to have this grip, which is called the dexterous grip. We don't need it any longer. Similarly, we kind of, our technologies enable us to look at papers this way, but a paper, a screen like this. Earlier, we used to write it down, so there was a downward, sort of glance of our eyes. So many things have changed. They've changed technologically, but have they altered the basic constraints? That is one question, cognitive constraints. Secondly, so my first question was, what do you mean by planetary age? Second, have any constraints changed at all, or is it a matter of degree? And thirdly, we are coming to know that we have hosted bacteria and things like that, but we always have. Maybe Hobbes was afraid of a state of nature, but earlier humans were not.
Okay, thank you. So first thing is you're about knowing about our aesthetics of the interior, which is also the question that Anjali raising. It reminds me of a friend called Paramesh Acharya, an old communist, older than me, dead now, who worked at the Indian Institute of Management, because your father was connected for a while. And once I was visiting, and Paramesh came into my friend Shoilo Ghosh's office and announced to me, he said, "Dipesh, the doctor says my liver looks beautiful." So, and I joked, I said, "Paramesh, what meaning does that sentence have?" If somebody brought me a liver on a plate, will I be able to say, "This is Paramesh's liver is so beautiful"?
As your liver.
Yeah, and so we had a joke about that. But interestingly, the language of his doctor was actually producing an aesthetics of, like people do, colonoscopy and say, "Oh, it looks beautiful." And so doctors do have a way of using beautiful for interiors, but which we have no way of sharing. But the thing is, in my book, I actually don't talk about technology so much. I just have a few pages on a notion that a particular geologist at Duke University called Peter Haff has put forward of something called the technosphere. And the technosphere is the way that technology connects all human beings and institutions globally in such a way as to support, say, 7 billion or 9 billion or 10 billion people. And his argument is, I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but his argument is that if you withdrew, if this technosphere collapsed, human population would collapse to 11 million. So he therefore argues that this kind of technosphere is preconditioned to biology. I mean, in other words, without investing in this kind of technological connectivity, we won't survive. So that's the use I make of technology, or I don't talk about technology. So, but the person who tells this story in roughly along the same way, I mean, several people have told this story, but it's also the Israeli historian Harari. in his book
You will
on
know
Sapien.
something,
Well, Noah. He actually tells the story of technology, interestingly, and it's not very different from what you were saying. But the question here is really what the expansion of the human realm in the 20th century is quite amazing. So if if it took humans to get to 1 billion, about 1.5 billion until 1900, and at 2000 we were 6 billion.
Yeah.
And so it's the expansion. So, and then when you do a higher resolution.
So it's a degree question. We have become.
No, well, the degree, well, I'll come to the degree question, what it means. And then if you look at the graphs for all different human institutions, like growths of petroleum use or paper production, all kinds of factors. So these are called the great acceleration graphs. And then you see that it really grows exponentially from 1950 on. And it kind of correlates with the growth of greenhouse gases and other things. So there's a kind of a 1950 cutoff. And if you have graphs at higher resolution, then you actually see that the graphs grow even more steeply from the 1970s on. Once China begins to modernize, the modernization. So this period is generally, historians call it the period of great acceleration in world history. So structurally it's not different, but the question is of the degree question becomes what many people now call the complexity question. In other words, when a thing grows so much and it becomes internally more complex. So let's say Indian population has grown in my lifetime more than 5 times. And cities have grown even more than that. Like Bangalore's growth in 2001 to 11 was just humongous. Delhi grew fast, Bangalore grew the fastest. And the argument that when systems grow, then growth itself produces some emergent properties of that system. So, and therefore, while the structural relationships that you're talking about remain the same, but there are emergent properties of a more complex system that poses new problems. And so for people talking about climate science, it's really, there's a physicist, very well-known physicist called Anderson, who published a paper, most of which is very readable, in 1971. It's a famous physics paper called More is Different. And that was the kind of one of the bases for complexity theory.
Yes.
And like to give you a simple example. So given the Indian population in the 1950s, Nehru could think of certain ways of solving those population, let's say the food problem through dam building and irrigation, right? Given the size of the population now, it's a far more complex problem. And sometimes when complex problems are difficult to solve, nations, it's easier for people to form fantasy solutions, blame it on Muslims, right? Or have a strong man at the center who's going to fix everything.
Yes,
so one could actually say that that the kind of politics we have now has partly to do with how these complexity problems. So in some ways, yes, growth, but growth itself produces interesting, what they call emergent properties. I don't go into this question, I mean, to come back to the planetary. So my point is that humans have thought about planetary thing for a long time. I mean, Jyotish.
Indians thought about it, yeah, and Indian.
Jyotish is planetary. Jyotish is planetary thinking. So even when the Pacific Islands were settled, people navigated by looking at stars and constellations. So planetary, and then of course the science. Exactly. So what? So my planet is a synonym for what Earth system scientists call Earth system. And that is a result of application of systems thinking to the question of understanding life. And it came out of exploration of Mars and Venus during the space race. And the reason, and so my point is that we've arrived in the 21st century. IPCC was set up in 1988. But historians were not paying any attention to what IPCC was doing, mainly because the media was not paying much attention. So Harvard historian Charles Meyer wrote an interesting Just give me one tick. Neeraj, I'll call you later. I'm doing an interview with people in India. Okay. Yeah. So my question is that, you see, the word Anthropocene hasn't been formalized.
No.
And there's no guarantee that all geologists will accept it.
Mm.
Many geologists argue that it should remain as an informal term,
Yes.
without being, and then there are many informal terms in geology. Many geologists talk about an ancient Anthropocene, which goes back to the hominin in management of fire. So it's before Homo sapiens. Then a middle Anthropocene, a late Anthropocene. So there are debates, and I'm not qualified to buy into those debates. But the volume of evidence they produce to document human impact on the biosphere, that's the evidence is, you can read and you can see it. But whether that amounts to a change in the nomenclature of the geological period is up to geologists. My point is that something happened in the 21st century, and this is why we are meeting, that the reports of the IPCC have gotten more and more traction in the media. So this latest report that came out, Anand just asked me to write an op-ed on it, right? My very first article, when I wrote about climate change, was in Bangla, and I wrote it in 2007 or 8 for a Bengali magazine called Baro Mas, now extinct. And none of my friends were interested because it just hadn't hit the media in the same way. So for me as a humanist, the planetary age is when concerns that go beyond the history, the globalization concerns, that is, go beyond the question of immigration, question of racism, question of capitalism, that talk about the role of the biosphere, the role of the carbon cycle, the role of carbon dioxide. These concerns are becoming general concerns. And so the planetary as part of a general concern in the media, in everyday awareness. So I actually begin the book by saying that if Hegel were still around and was trying to plumb a change in human consciousness, then he would notice that just the global concerns are still there, but they've been supplemented by concerns that I was calling planetary. And the other reason for calling it planetary age in human history is because Anthropocene cannot be a periodizing device for human history for the simple reason that a geological epoch can actually go, it's the smallest period, but it can last for 10, 20 million years. And humans may not last that long. So it can't be a periodizing device for human history. All I'm saying is that as we come into the 20th century, we are becoming more aware of these questions, planetary questions. How we're going to solve them, what we do with them is a different question. I don't answer that. So I'm simply saying, what does it mean for these things to become the concern in everyday newspapers, the concern of this kind of conversation for people who are not trained to adjudicate those questions. So I'm not trained to adjudicate whether it should be called Anthropocene or extension of Holocene or whatever. I leave that to geologists, to stratigraphers.
Sort of such a complex phenomenon is that it could be the obsession of our age because we are fantasizing animals and we need a kind of
culturally it's a very interesting phenomenon how this is the only geological term for periodization that has been debated by non-geologists so extensively. So people with no training in stratigraphy have gone ahead and said, oh, you can't call it Anthropocene, you have to call it this or that. And I don't go into the debate because I think I'm not qualified to go into the debate as to what it should be called, whether it should be formalized. But they have produced a very interesting, volumes of evidence. And there's a whole book they've produced, the stratigraphers, on the evidence that they're going to present to the International Geological Union to back up their suggestion that the moniker we adopted. And I'm not part of the second part, because they have to do that. They have to argue to other geologists. I can't do this. But the question of human impact, whether you still go on calling it Holocene or not, that seems pretty convincing. Yeah.
We've taken up more than an hour, but I just have
Okay.
one last question. It's
Sure.
a speculative question that I'm thinking we should ask every speaker.
Mhm.
What do you think? What do you think about something like an Indian animal studies, or simply something like an Indian animal, which could be a category is that is at once local, but is also a category of species. So could something like that help us think, planetarily instead of globally?
Look, I'll tell you something. I think we all, and this is my position, so I don't know if you agree. I mean, clearly the nation state is still useful on certain things. And for very pragmatic reasons, I don't want the Indian nation state to break up. I think I support the idea of its unity in spite of all the injustices that the nation state may do to certain groups within the nation. But I also think that the nation state is increasingly an extremely inadequate political formation for addressing these questions. And the simple example is the Himalayas. The rivers coming out of the Himalayas service a whole range of countries from Pakistan to Vietnam. And there's absolutely no multilateral authority set up to protect the health of these rivers, protect the health of the glaciers. Because many of the rivers are snow-fed, not all. When Sundarlal Bahuguna, when there was somebody was talking about him, and they quoted him as having said, and I totally agree. He said, the real product of the Himalayas are not apples; it's water. It was such a beautiful statement that he made, and this water is as important to the Chinese as it is to Pakistanis, as it is to Indians, Bangladeshis, Vietnamese.
And to animals.
And to animals, and to the trees. I mean, the entire life forms, the birds. I mean, think about, whereas every nation thinks of these things as their own. And I think it's getting to a stage where a simple nation state-based claim on these resources is probably becoming criminal to the people of all nations. So in that sense, I think whether you do if you do non-human studies, animal studies, probably the idea would be to critique the category Indian, because over the long term, animals have migrated from one place to another, right? I mean, there are tiger fossils found in the Himalayas. So yeah, because actually the British instituted this thing of Indian geology, Indian paleontology, Indian botany, Indian zoology. And maybe it's time to, because I really think we all need to we acknowledge the reality of the nation states, and also I think on the pragmatic grounds on which they have to stay to protect us from many things. But I think we need to voice more and more the limitations of this formation and the limitations of the UN. The UN was set up to deal with global problems, not planetary problems. The UN is basically an institution where people do stalling exercise. And look at Kashmir, I mean, basically UN stalled the Kashmir problem. And now it's on the basis of stalling of that problem that, we claim part of it as our territory, or the Pakistan claims part of it as our territory. Look at the Israel-Palestine question. The UN it basically helps to stall. I mean, what it calls peace is a mode of stalling a question. Whereas the climate is coming in the nature of an emergency. And if you use the UN to stall, I mean, look at the question of air conditioners, which I discuss a little bit in the book, right? When India was participating in the 2016 conference on air conditioners and the chemicals that go into the air conditioners, India bargained hard to be in the group of countries that will be the slowest to change, because cities are becoming so hot that even poor people are buying air conditioners. They can't survive without air conditioners, and air conditioners will save life. And it's also possible that the air conditioning industry lobbied the government because it's a booming market for them, right? So nations go to these conferences which are about planetary problems, and then they bargain for time continue present policies and to slow down the pace of change and all of those things. And clearly different special interests flow into that zone. But today it seems to me that if the stalling continues, the price will be paid by the poor heavily, like as with every crisis. And that's why it seems to me that the problem has become even more political, for humans than it used to be. And I think that's why messaging is important. What you're thinking, doing, writing is important. Taking it to taking the message to school kids, taking the message to people who will put pressures. At least you're in India and not in China, so at least you have the advantage still, in spite of everything, of protesting, writing, whatever. I mean, however limited it might be, because of the complexity question. There's also the desire to find an easy solution, the strongman solution or the scapegoat solution to problems. But I really think that there's a deep institutional deficit in the world, and the nation state is part of the story of that deficit.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for speaking to us.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
Really
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
And I think the concept of Anthropocene is just so challenging conceptually. So many things to think about. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and very nice to see you again, Rukmini.
Yeah, we should
and
be
nice to meet you all.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good. Take care and stay well. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.